This is an update on the Religious Discrimination Bill, which many of you will know the government had been promising to introduce into the Parliament before the end of the year, and the last sitting week of Parliament for the year was the week starting the 1st of December. Now that week has come and it has gone, and all the MPs and staffers are heading back to their various corners of the country, and there is no bill. And you might be thinking, well, why is that? Well, the Prime Minister has announced, and indeed there he is announcing on the screen, he has announced that the bill will be delayed until February 2020. And the short story is this: it's been delayed because we asked for it to be delayed. So that's a pretty remarkable thing, that our concerns with the bill were raised with the Prime Minister, with the Attorney General, with others as well in Cabinet and the party at large, and those concerns were heard. The sense that the bill isn't quite right, it isn't quite ready, and it is going to be redrafted, and that's been ordered by the PM, and it will be introduced again in February 2020 after that second draft is released around Christmas, New Year. This is good news because your concerns, our concerns, have been heard. Now, I've been saying for a little while that there are some concerns. Let me step you through in as clear terms as I can what some of those are, just so you're in the picture. We've always said, for example, that a discrimination framework is not the ideal way to protect religious freedom because those are two slightly different kinds of rights. And also, Christians are not people who sue using discrimination laws on the whole. And so it's not necessarily that helpful. Also, a lot of the state discrimination laws already exist. However, when the first draft of this bill was introduced earlier in the year, it included a number of extra things that made it a genuinely helpful piece of legislation, which responded to a range of actual, genuine community issues which we are coming across on a regular basis here at ACL and within church circles and Christian circles and faith-based circles. There's obviously the famous people like Folau, but there's a whole lot of others as well who are really requiring some legal protection. They're not sort of famous enough to have their case heard in the same way. And look, the extras that the bill offered were, firstly, for example, a clause to ensure that the next Israel Folau won't happen. A clause to prevent the next Archbishop Julian Porteous from happening. A clause to ensure that medical professionals who have a faith would have some degree of conscientious protection in their work, midwives and pharmacists and doctors and nurses and all these kinds of people. And also a clause in there that says that Christian organisations, faith-based organisations like charities, schools and religious bodies and so on would be able to act in accordance with their beliefs and uphold their ethos without running foul of the law. Those are all great inclusions. But when you look into the details, there's a couple of little issues which I'll explain, which we then explain to the government, and that's why the bill's getting redrafted. The first of those concerns doesn't actually relate to any of those 4 bonus features that are really good that I sort of mentioned. The first of those concerns actually relates to the fact that the bill doesn't define religious activity. And that goes to the very heart and core of the bill. Everything builds off of that. Religious activity is the thing the bill protects. That's at the heart of it. And if the bill doesn't define what religious activity is, then the courts will define what religious activity is. And based on the trends right around the world and here in Australia, courts are defining religious activity more and more narrowly. Think about it this way. Would an Instagram post be considered by a court religious activity? Would a conversation over a water cooler at work be considered by a court to be religious activity? Would giving a presentation at an ostensibly secular conference, but about, say, gender with a Christian understanding of gender, interwoven, is that a religious activity? And so I could go on. And so you find yourself in a situation where you could get courts taking a very narrow understanding of what religious activity is. For example, it's going to church, it's praying, it's fasting, things like that. But no, it's not those public activities. They're not religious. They're secular activities, public activities, commercial activities, things like that, professional activities. You don't want to get into that situation. And so the bill really has to make it clear that actually activities that you engage in every day, which are consistent with your faith and grounded in your faith, and they're genuine and all the rest of it, well, that should be protected. But then if you move into some of those 4 bonuses that I mentioned, some of those 4 features of the bill that make it really useful and genuinely helpful to ordinary people, you can look at the Israel Folau clause, I call it, the clause that says basically if you make a statement of belief, your employer can't fire you, except under certain conditions. Now, the problem with that at first is that it had the unintended consequence of enabling secondary boycotts and activist campaigns against businesses. Because what it said was that, if you're a company, you can't fire someone based on their genuine statement of belief that isn't malicious and nasty. You can't fire them unless it would cause you unjustifiable financial hardship to keep them. And you know where that's going to go. You get, the Rugby Australia situation where you had, sponsors, as the chairman said, Qantas and others, and the chairman mentioned sponsors who put huge pressure on Rugby Australia and said, we're going to pull our sponsorship if you don't sack this guy. Or you know how activists use Twitter and they use boycotts and all those strategies to, it could be against a big bank, it could be against somebody else to say, so long as you keep that guy employed, we're going to make your life a misery. And then the company has to turn around and say, well, we've got to fire them because it's causing us unjustifiable financial hardship. You see how that accidentally enabled secondary boycotts. So that needs to be changed. Whatever the limit is, whatever the line in the sand is with that, it can't be as described because it will enable those secondary boycotts. Another problem with that section was the fact that, I've forgotten, what was it? Yes. Another problem with that section, of course, was the fact that it only applies to companies with more than $50 million in revenue. In other words, they're the only ones that can't be bad guys and dismiss people simply because they made a statement of belief. And I can understand why there would be an exemption for a small business, because you think of little mechanics and things like that. It's a different world, family businesses, things like that. But the problem, of course, is that public sector employees aren't included. And a lot of the people who contact us for legal help because they've done something quite innocent as an expression of their religious faith, even in their private time, and they've had things, done against them by their employer, are actually in the public service. And public sector employees should be protected. Then you turn to that clause that I mentioned, and I described it as being the clause to prevent the next Archbishop Julian Porteous from happening. Now, Julian Porteous said a few things about marriage in a pastoral letter, which were very gentle and kind and decent. However, he fell foul of state anti-discrimination laws. There's a section in this bill that says a statement of belief shouldn't fall foul of a state anti-discrimination law. But of course, there's an issue there in the sense that it says sort of unless it vilifies people. And the bill itself does not define what vilify means. So again, the courts will define it, and until then, nobody knows what we can and cannot say. Is vilify a really high-level thing? Is it basically saying, look, it's up at the stage of hatred and incitement to violence? Or is it a low-level thing that says, well, actually, if you're offending people, then you could be vilifying them? We don't actually know. And so the word vilify needs to be defined to straighten out that clause. I mentioned that section as well that says that Christian charities, or faith-based, I should say, charities and educational institutions and religious bodies can act according to their faith and not fall foul of the law. There's an issue with that one which says unless they are engaged in primarily commercial activities. And that sounds reasonable at first until you realise that there's an awful lot of churches and an awful lot of faith groups out there that run a whole lot of entities that look commercial, but actually they're raising money for a good cause, or they're promoting the tenets of the faith. You think of Christian campsites, you think of childcare centres run by some of the bigger churches and all this kind of thing, and they want to make sure their staff are people who will uphold the ethos and the faith of the institution. That's important that that standard be altered somehow. There probably is a limit to be included in that section, but that's probably not quite the right limit unless there are some other changes. These are examples of the sorts of things that were put together in a letter, and ACL wrote a letter, and we signed it with a whole lot of other faith groups as well, which went to the government. And look, the government has heard your voice. The government's heard our voice, and the government is redrafting this bill. It is a good thing. And let me say this before I close. Why is it that we want to protect religious freedom, as it's called? Well, my interest in this is really so that the truth might be free, so that we might be able to be witnesses to Christ and God's truth and the gospel in all of life, in the way we live, the way we speak, the way we conduct ourselves, in every sphere in which we find ourselves, as Jesus would have us to do. And we can do that without living in fear, and we can do that without experiencing dreadful loss. And I think that that's a fulfillment of Paul's prayer, that the life of godliness might be a life of peace. 1 Timothy 2, he says, pray for that when you're praying for your rulers and those who are in government. So that's why we support religious freedom as Christians. And we look forward to February, well, actually we look forward to the New Year period when the second draft of this bill will be released, and there will be an opportunity for you to participate in the parliamentary process by raising your voice come February. Thank you. Hey, thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, then make sure to hit the like button. If you want to never miss another video again, make sure to subscribe, or you can right now watch more videos right here. Cheers.